Are you passionate about shaping India's future? Keen to find solutions for India's most pressing challenges? Look no further than Takshishila's postgraduate program in public policy. This 48-weekend program will equip you with the knowledge, skills, and network needed to pivot to a meaningful career in public policy. Apply in the link below by June 1st. The program begins June 20th. Hope to see you there.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to today's All Things Policy. I'm Brigadier Anil Raman, Research Fellow at the Takshashila Institution, Bengaluru. Today, as part of our series on the Iran war, we shall discuss the current situation in the Middle East, that is, focusing on the regional involvement and its impact on the US-Iran war. Joining me is our special guest, Will Todman, who is the Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and a Senior Fellow in the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that is the CSIS, in Washington, D.C. Will has over a decade of experience working on conflict, governance, and displacement in the Middle East, and has conducted field research in 12 countries across the region. He has taught at various universities, and before joining the CSIS in 2016, Will worked for the Office of the United Nations Special Envoy to Syria at a very critical time and at the British Embassy in Beirut. He has also co-founded a non-profit organization that works for refugees and immigrants in the Washington, D.C. area, which he has led for 7 years. He's a polyglot. He holds a BA in Arabic and Modern Hebrew from Oxford University and an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown Universities, where he studied Persian also. I believe you also speak Spanish and French. Will has written for and contributed to commented on leading outlets including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, BBC, and he has also testified to the UK Parliament. I'm sure that we could not have had a more qualified candidate to speak about the regional dynamics of the US-Iran conflict. To get things started, could you just paint the picture of when President Trump returned to office in 2025, what was the overall strategic condition of the Middle East? Did the region appear to be stabilizing, fragmenting, or simply frozen in, unresolved conflict?
Well, firstly, thank you so much, Brigadier Raman. It's a real privilege and a pleasure to be on your podcast and to meet you today. I think somehow it feels like a lifetime ago when President Trump returned to office. But I think the region had just undergone some really important shifts, which I think laid the groundwork for the decision he made to join Israel in the operation against Iran in earlier this year. The ripple effects of the October the 7th attacks by Hamas against Israel were continuing to play out. And they had really caused a dramatic shift in the balance of power across the region. So, of course, Israel's response to those attacks severely downgraded Hamas in Gaza. But then also new conflict broke out in Lebanon when Israel struck Hezbollah, killing the former leader Hassan Nasrallah in, I think, a really major blow to Hezbollah in Lebanon. That contributed to the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria next door. So Bashar al-Assad had been the dictator of Syria for decades, and he, to a large degree, had relied on Hezbollah. Hezbollah militia fighters were active across Syria against Syrian opposition forces, but he also relied on Russia. And of course, Russia was distracted, I think, to a degree by the war in Ukraine. And so Syrian rebels then saw Hezbollah being weakened, they saw Russia being distracted, and they launched this lightning offensive in December of 2024, which ended up toppling the regime of Bashar al-Assad in just a matter of weeks. And so then if we take a step back, then we see that Iran's network of partners and proxies across the region had been significantly weakened. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then the fall of Bashar al-Assad, an ally of Iran in Syria. And so Iran was much more isolated than it had been for decades. At the same time, President Biden had not, negotiated a deal with Iran that would lead to sanctions relief. So the Iranian regime was still under crippling sanctions, and the currency was devaluing in a rapid rate. Iran was also experiencing, various other crises at the same time, including a very severe water crisis, actually, which led Iranian leaders to say that they will have to move the capital from Tehran down to the coast of the Persian Gulf in the south. And so I think the regime was really quite weak. And I think, when President Trump came into office, he looked around the region. He saw Israel was very much had established itself as a major power in the region, if not the regional hegemon. Iran was very much weakened, and Arab Gulf states were undertaking these very ambitious strategies of diversifying their economies away from reliance on oil and gas revenues. And they were eager, I think, to see a United States that would, and other international actors as well, I should say, that would engage with them on the economic front, less so on the security front. And I think I think President Trump was probably eagerly awaiting some of the economic opportunities that were lying there in the Arab Gulf states.
You have set the scene very well. Could we delve a little bit deeper into what exactly was Israel's sort of strategy at that time?
Yes, definitely. So Israel had long pursued a strategy of mowing the grass. This idea that when threats reach a certain threshold, they would attack and they would downgrade those threats. But I think when Prime Minister Netanyahu looked around the region, he saw a number of opportunities to take historic action against the threats, against the non-state actors that had long represented a threat to Israel and to Israeli civilians. And each time he took a bet, it seemed to play off. So he, took a bet, I think, by launching this large-scale invasion into Gaza. I think we might have assumed that the international outcry to that would have reached such a threshold that it would force the Israeli government to take a step back, but that ultimately did not really happen. Then he took a really, bold bet against Hezbollah in Lebanon. We had the pager attacks, which is when Israel had booby-trapped pagers that Hezbollah operatives were using. I think that took out a lot of the middle and sort of upper echelons of Hezbollah. And then, he took more and more risks with assassinations of major leaders within Hezbollah. And again, those seemed to pay off, those risks. He took more risks when it came to Yemen, and attacking the Houthis in Yemen, who control much of the north of the country and had threatened shipping through the Red Sea. Again, Israel conducted a campaign of airstrikes, but also targeted assassinations against senior Houthi leaders, which again seemed to pay off, and there didn't seem to be really a backlash. Now, I think one point where perhaps he went too far was Prime Minister Netanyahu went too far was when he struck Doha. This was in September of last year, of 2025. When Netanyahu struck or tried to strike a meeting of Hamas officials who were meeting to discuss a ceasefire deal in Doha, in the capital of Qatar. And I think that backfired because that really did result in a degree of horror from Gulf Arab states who previously thought that they would never themselves face an Israeli attack. I think it contributed to changing or to shattering the image of Gulf states as a haven of stability within, this difficult region. And it resulted in the United States forging a defense pact with Qatar, sort of in response. So I think Israel's strategy was increasingly bold. I think because the early bets paid off, that encouraged Netanyahu to go further. And then probably the most major bet was striking Iran back in June of last year, what we now call the 12-day war. So initially launching strikes, even while the US was negotiating with Iran, but then encouraging President Trump to join into those offensives and convincing him that only US weapons would be able to hit Iran's nuclear facilities deep underground in the Fordo mountain. And again, this was very bold, but it seemed to pay off. So I think, Israel is now operating militarily across the whole region, across the whole of the Middle East, and I think feels able to strike when threats reach a certain threshold.
In your opinion, why did they end the 12-day war without, taking it to a logical conclusion? They had even, I think, created an insurrection within Iran, but all that, it really did not progress.
Yes, I think at the time, it was difficult to assess the level of damage that the attacks had brought to Iran's nuclear facilities. It was believed that the strikes had indeed obliterated, or at least President Trump said they had obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities. And so I think Trump was, felt that this was a success. He didn't want to get bogged down into a much longer term conflict. Ironic given where we are now, but at the time, I think he believed that this could be a very dramatic but contained operation that would then force the Iranians back to the negotiating table, and where they would capitulate on many of their previous demands, and President Trump would be able to forge a deal. I think it's probably true that the Israelis wanted to keep going, and that President Trump probably said, no, that's enough. Let the dust settle. Let's see if we can now work with the supreme leader, now the late Ali Khamenei. And I think President Trump really did believe that there could be a diplomatic outcome after that conflict.
You also have so much of expertise in, the proxy actors who work along with Iran. So could you sort of sketch out what was Iran's proxy network, before October 7th,
Yep.
after they got hit last year, and now where they again seem to be revived and, fighting hard, especially in Lebanon?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. So for decades, Iran established a network of partners across the region that served as a forward deterrence. And the idea was that the Iranian regime could protect itself by using this network of partners to be the first ones to engage with their enemies, whether that is Hezbollah fighting against Israel in Lebanon. But the idea was that Israel would not want to directly attack Iran because Iran could then activate its partners and encourage them to join in the conflict. That would mean a state like Israel would then be attacked by multiple different angles, by Hamas from Gaza, by Hezbollah from Lebanon, the Houthis from Yemen, Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian regime from Syria, and then by Iran-backed militias in Iraq as well. I think often we refer to these groups as proxies, and I personally think that's not a very analytically useful term because in reality, these groups look quite different, and I think they have different degrees of autonomy from the Iranian regime. So probably the group with the highest level autonomy was Hamas in Gaza. In the aftermath of the October the 7th attacks, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not Iran had ordered Hamas to conduct these attacks. And I think the assessments that have leaked from the intelligence communities indicate there's no evidence that Iran actually ordered these attacks. I think these were driven by Hamas itself internally for its own purposes. Perhaps Iran knew that they were planning something like this, but I don't think it was at their orders. Then I'd say after that, Hezbollah previously was, certainly had close ties. They receive weapons, they receive funding from the Iranian government, but they also have a degree of autonomy where they're not just a pawn of the Iranian regime. They are a political actor within Lebanon. They are pursuing national goals as well as regional goals in service of Iran's interests. Similarly, the Syrian regime, Iran was just one of its international partners. And so the regime was balancing between Iran and Russia, but also different kinds of militias that were present in the country that were supporting Bashar al-Assad. And then in Iraq, I think probably these are some of the groups that had the closest ties to the Iranian regime. I mean, the geographical proximity with Iraq neighboring Iran helps there. I think there's just more movement across between Iran and Iraq. So then, after actually a turning point was one of the very last acts of Donald Trump in 2020, just before he left office at the end of his first term, and he ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. So Qasem Soleimani was the commander of the Quds Force, which is the external part of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And he had been seen as the central node that was nurturing and keeping together this network of proxies. And I think probably what happened after his assassination was that these groups gained a slightly greater level of autonomy, where they were less beholden to the Iranian regime. The successors of Soleimani were not as effective as he had been in holding them all together and coordinating them. So in the run-up then to the October the 7th attacks, I think we actually saw a bit of a divergence from these proxies. And then, but then I should say, the operations that Israel undertook to downgrade Hezbollah and as I keep saying, in Lebanon and the others, I think that actually reversed that trend. And that meant that Hezbollah in Lebanon was so much weaker because of all of these assassinations and strikes against their infrastructure, that they became more reliant on Iran. And so I think, they were simultaneously much weaker and more dependent on Iran. And so then when Israel and the US launched their strikes against Iran on the 28th of February this year, Hezbollah joined in the very next day. And I think most analysts believe that this was really encouraged by Iran, that Iran wanted them to put more pressure on Israel. This was, the point that was that these proxies were always meant to play. So I think then it caused a real backlash in Lebanon, because even some of the supporters of Hezbollah said, "You're not fighting for Palestinian rights. You're not fighting for Lebanese interests. You're fighting for Iranian interests. And of course, it brought on a severe response from Israel, including a ground invasion and the displacement of more than 1 million Lebanese from the south of the country. And so I think that has produced something of a backlash.
Earlier, we have seen that the Houthis were very close to Iran, or they still are. They have not really interfered too much. Is it a calibrated decision by Iran? They're holding them back for a second phase or something?
Yeah, this is fascinating, I think, because, of course, it was the Houthis who really proved the power of blocking a strategic choke point. The Houthis had previously threatened and attacked shipping through the Red Sea, through Bab el-Mandeb, which is this choke point on the southwestern side of the Arabian Peninsula, in between the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. After Israel's attack on Gaza in 2023, and then into 2024, they proved just how disruptive it can be to attack shipping through a choke point. And so it was a preview in some ways of what we've then seen through the Strait of Hormuz. I think there are 3 potential reasons for why the Houthis have not engaged yet, and I honestly don't know which of them is the right reason. There's one idea is that they are so weak because of the previous Israeli strikes and US strikes against them that they know that if they joined in this conflict at this point, the response from Israel and the United States would probably be overwhelming and they may not survive that retaliation. So it may be that they don't feel that they are strong enough to withstand the response from Israel and the US. A second reason could be that someone has provided them with an incentive not to participate in this conflict. Now, this sounds a bit like we're getting into conspiracy theory sort of territory, but it is possible that someone like Saudi Arabia has provided them with an incentive not to engage. And for Saudi Arabia, there are clear interests here. I mean, currently Saudi Arabia is exporting most of its oil through the Red Sea on the western coast as a mitigation because it can't transport it through the Strait of Hormuz. And so I think that if the Houthis were to block the Red Sea as well, then that would really undermine Saudi Arabia's economic stability and security in a major way. So that could be what's going on. Or it could be that they are just biding their time, as you said, and that the Iranians only want to sort of activate the Houthis when they truly feel that they're under an existential threat from the US and Israel. And Iranian officials keep saying something to this effect. They keep hinting at it. They say, we have other cards to play. Do not attack our energy infrastructure in the way that President Trump has threatened to do. There would be severe consequences. And I think that is a clear potential that they are waiting for that. So if that third option is correct, it implies that the Iranian regime has not yet felt an existential threat. And I think that's probably correct. If I had to guess, it's probably that last one. But it is really interesting that they have not engaged yet.
You just mentioned Saudi Arabia. So, after Trump came, the US-Saudi relationship has seen certain ups and downs. So could you explain that as well as their behavior in this conflict? Because there are reports which came out saying that, behind the scenes, they requested Trump to hit Iran hard. Now you have reports coming out saying that they wanted to avoid war. So there's a lot of clutter, if you could throw some light on that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the Saudi-US relationship was stronger under the first Trump term. But then when President Biden, or then candidate Biden, was campaigning, he said that he would make or treat Saudi Arabia as the pariah that it is. He was referring to the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, which was believed to have been under the orders of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, although I should say he denies that, of course. But it was a really tense relationship. I think they had this awkward fist bump at one point when Biden visited MBS. in Saudi Arabia, where he didn't want to shake his hand and somehow thought a fist bump would look better. But it was a really awkward relationship because ultimately Saudi Arabia is still the region's, one of the region's most powerful states. Economically, of course, it is a critical member of OPEC. Its ability to shape global energy prices is very important. And it also has a lot of wealth. It has a large sovereign wealth fund that it can use to pursue strategic investments. So I think when President Trump came into office, he really wanted to bolster this relationship. He saw the potential of Gulf money that, some of these Gulf states would invest in his own priorities. And that's why his first planned international visit was to Saudi Arabia, and then Qatar, and then the UAE. He actually visited, I think, the Vatican first because of the funeral of the former Pope. But still, his first planned visit was to Saudi Arabia. I think that sent a message that showed, Saudi Arabia is a really critical part of the US foreign policy, a key partner. But a lot of the relationship with Saudi Arabia has been tied to the US effort to encourage normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But I think that's a difficult prospect for the Saudi government, in part because the Saudi public is really strongly opposed to it as a result of what Israel has done in Gaza. And so I think, often we talk about some of these countries as being authoritarian and not being dependent on public opinion, but I don't think that's true. They still have to factor in public opinion to an important degree when formulating foreign policy. So I personally think Saudi Arabia is some way away from normalizing with Israel. And I think President Trump ultimately came to realize that. And while he's still pushing it, he also wanted to deepen the relationship in other ways. I find it very hard to believe that Saudi Arabia would have initially supported the Israeli and US attack on Iran. Saudi Arabia's economic vision is built on the idea that there is stability in the region that will encourage investment and that investment will support the diversification away from oil revenues. So I think initially it is probably true that Saudi Arabia was opposed to this conflict. But then once it began, I think they then saw an opportunity, and they then were concerned that President Trump would stop too soon and that he would leave a weakened but more emboldened Iranian regime in place, which could continue to threaten Saudi interests for the years and perhaps even decades to come. And so then I think probably we did see some reports, and I could believe it, that they were saying, finish the job, keep going. If you're going to do this, please properly, encourage regime change. I think now that they have probably realized that the Iranian regime is not about to be toppled. Instead, they're very keen to ensure that the US reestablishes a sense of deterrence so that Saudi Arabia is not a target of continued but maybe low-intensity Iranian attacks. We saw just last week, we saw the Iranians attacked a oil pipeline in the UAE, in Fujairah, and the port of Fujairah, which is its sort of mitigation strategy because it can export directly into the Arabian Sea rather than into the Gulf. So it bypasses the Strait of Hormuz. And there wasn't a very strong US response to that. And the reporting indicates that Saudi Arabia was furious that there had not been a strong US response, and that they actually denied or they threatened to stop the US from being able to use their bases in Saudi Arabia unless they attacked to try to, again, establish this deterrence. So I think in many ways, this is now the nightmare scenario for Saudi Arabia, where they have a weakened but kind of cornered Iranian regime, which continues to threaten the Arab Gulf states, that does not seem likely to be toppled anytime soon, and is probably we're entering into a period of prolonged instability in the region. I think that is the very opposite of what Saudi Arabia wanted going into this conflict.
Very well explained. We also saw this UAE, resigning from OPEC in a huff, as well as a lot of commentary about how the relations between Saudi Arabia and the UAE were no longer what they were, and the UAE basically announcing an open pact with Israel.
Yep.
So, what are the motivations which sort of what explains this?
Yeah. So the rivalry between the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular has been bubbling away for years. So it sort of reared its head in a major way in January earlier this year in Yemen. So the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been backing opposing forces in Yemen, and the UAE-backed forces made rapid gains across the country, particularly in the east. And this really alarmed Saudi Arabia, which actually responded with airstrikes against UAE-backed forces. So they came quite close to actually fighting in Yemen, although it was largely through proxy forces that they were both backing. And I think they fundamentally are competitors because they are aiming for, or they have similar strategic goals. They both want to diversify away from oil revenues, as I keep saying. They want to be a regional hub of investment and business and private sector activity. And the UAE is much further along in that regard. The UAE is less dependent on oil revenues than any other Arab Gulf state. Of course, Dubai is, considered to be a kind of global capital of business and tourism and, luxury lifestyle. That's what Saudi Arabia wants as well. And so Saudi Arabia actually brought in a law a few years ago that said any foreign company that wanted to operate in Saudi Arabia had to have its regional headquarters in Saudi Arabia. And this was a direct challenge to the UAE because, of course, lots of companies already have their their regional headquarters in the UAE. So this is, this rivalry is kind of long-standing. I think they're both targeting similar kinds of business opportunities, and they see each other as competitors there. But when it comes to OPEC, I think Saudi Arabia is still highly, or its economic stability is highly dependent on the price of oil. And so for them, OPEC is critical. Setting the price of oil, making sure that their budget breaks even is very important because they are much more reliant on those revenues than the UAE. For the UAE, they have slightly less of an interest in making sure the price is a certain amount because they have already diversified further into the private sector, but also renewables. They have a nuclear power plant. They have invested in solar in a really big way. And so for them, I think they want more freedom to be able to export when they want. And they don't mind as much how much the cost is. But then you mentioned Israel as well, and they've also taken really quite different stances on, their regional partners. So the UAE, of course, was a member of the Abraham Accords, signed under President Trump's first term. They normalized with Israel, and they have continued to develop ties with Israel. They have to some degree, security ties, but also in terms of tech, investment, trade. Their ties are really establishing, growing in a big way. Saudi Arabia has still not normalized with Israel, as we've been saying. And I think Saudi Arabia views Israel as a bit more of a threat. I think, as I said, this outcome is kind of Saudi Arabia's worst nightmare. And I think they probably blame Israel for that because they think it was Israel pushing the US to attack Iran. And so they have really different views on Israel, and the UAE now is doubling down on that. And so in some ways, we're seeing new axes forming. So one is probably including India. So India, the UAE, Israel. Of course, there was the I2U2 idea, which would be India, Israel, the UAE, and the US. That would be a kind of trade corridor through the region. And then I think the opposing one that we're seeing is Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Turkey, and to some degree, probably Syria, Qatar, maybe to a slightly lesser degree.
Perhaps China?
China, I think, is tricky. China's kind of in both. I think China doesn't really want to choose sides here. China continues to have ties with Iran and Israel, with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So I think China's playing more of a balancing role. But these axes do seem to be emerging and strengthening in the aftermath of this conflict. We saw Saudi Arabia signed a defense pact with Pakistan. That was before this conflict broke out. But I think, that was an indication of the fact that Saudi Arabia wants to diversify its security partnerships. We've seen a growing security partnership between Saudi Arabia and Turkey as well. So, we're now, I think these inter-Gulf rifts are probably going to grow going forward. There was a moment where it looked like perhaps the common enemy of Iran would bring them all together and they would have a consolidated response. I think that hope is over now. If anything, we're heading towards perhaps the dissolution of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, because its members have moved in such different directions.
What about Qatar? Where does Qatar stand? It was a very powerful actor before the conflict.
It is, yeah. Qatar is a powerful and important actor. Qatar is much more affected economically by this conflict than either the UAE or Saudi Arabia, because it has no alternative maritime trade route that can circumvent the Strait of Hormuz. So if you look at the projected effects on GDP, Qatar is among the most affected countries because it really can't get, I think just yesterday it got its first ship through the Strait of Hormuz, but that was the first one in 2.5 months. So I think Qatar is going to be feeling the economic pain of this in important ways. But Qatar continues to see value in speaking to a range of different actors. It has long played a mediating role in international conflicts. And if you just look at the number of phone calls between leaders in Qatar and Iran, I think Qatar has the highest number of phone calls at this stage since the conflict broke out. So even though Qatar has come under direct attack multiple times by Iran, including one attack, I should say, on a Qatari gas production facility, which destroyed 17% of Qatar's gas production and is probably going to take between 3 and 5 years to recover from it. So they have really suffered in a very big way economically, but they continue to talk to the Iranians because I think they have to learn to live with the regime, and they would rather have a relationship with them, the ability to talk rather than taking a more aggressive stance. And it's the UAE that has probably taken the most aggressive stance against Iran in the region.
But, I mean, why, just looking at it from the military point of view, UAE is quite vulnerable to Iran in terms of size, in terms of distance, in terms of almost every factor. So what is it that drives them to be so aggressive towards Iran?
I think the UAE certainly is vulnerable, and it has been hit. I think it's been hit more times than anyone else by Iranian either missile or drone attacks. But it does have some alternative options. So again, I keep saying it has this pipeline to Fujairah, which means that it is still able to export bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. So I think that mitigation strategy allows it to take some more risks when it comes to Iran. But I think also it is because of its relationship with Israel. And we actually saw reporting that Israel has deployed the Iron Dome missile defense system to the UAE. That's a first. As far as we know, Israel has never deployed this internationally before. And it even apparently included the deployment of Israeli troops to operate the systems. So the UAE is really doubling down on its relationship with Israel. And I think Israel has the most aggressive stance of anyone in the region towards Iran. And I think, the UAE sees that It really does not want to live with this current Iranian regime, and it would rather take continued risks to try to topple it and to try to get to a better political outcome than some of the others, which are more cautious because they fear the consequences of continued attacks.
How do you think the way this conflict has played out? It appears that Iran is in a somewhat more favorable position than the United States. While the US may have had tactical victories, the strategic situation is a stalemate, which is a victory for Iran being the weaker power. I mean, in my perception. So, how do you think the Iranians sort of perceive that now? And what would their motivations for a ceasefire, negotiations be at all?
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. I think in part this is because of the goals that each side had set. And I think Iran's goal was to survive, or the Iranian regime's goal was to survive. And it's important to, I think, say just how weak they were coming into this. As I said at the start of our conversation, they'd lost so many of their regional proxies. They had just faced historic protests in January, which they put down with severe brutality. But the economic crisis was so bad that they, I think they really were feeling very vulnerable. And so for them, they just wanted to survive the military attack by Israel and the US. And I think then when they began to threaten the Strait of Hormuz, they realized that they had a strategic card to play that in many ways is far more powerful than their nuclear program, which has long been, what they have viewed as their real kind of trump card to continue to have the potential to, get towards a nuclear weapon in the future. Now I think they know it's very cheap to threaten the Strait of Hormuz. You really, you can literally have some guys in a speedboat with, threatening shipping, and so I think that has made them feel much more powerful. And then also, even though the military campaign has had the tactical successes that you said, it has not forced them to capitulate. And in some ways, we've seen the emergence and the consolidation of the power of the military and security elite within Iran, forces linked to the IRGC in particular that are, really now supreme in Iran, and in a way that they didn't used to be. There used to be a degree of politics in Iran where, I'm not trying to say it was a democracy, but there were different political factions that were jostling for power that would rise and would fall. And I think now the power is quite firmly in the hands of that military and security elite. And so I think, they realize that they have caused enormous harm to the global economy in a pretty cheap way. And now they think that they should not negotiate away their greatest assets. And so I think that's why we saw yesterday that their response to the US framework agreement proposal was to say, no, they will not dismantle their nuclear facilities. They will not allow all of their highly enriched uranium to be transported out of Iran. They're sticking firm to some of these red lines that they have articulated. And I think now they believe that they can outlast President Trump. They think that the longer this goes on, the greater the pain to Trump. And so they think that the terms of an agreement will only improve over time at this stage. Whereas I think President Trump initially thought the military campaign would force them to surrender. It didn't. Then he thought the economic blockade on Iranian ships would force them to capitulate. That didn't, in part because they have other ways of mitigation strategies, and they've been evading sanctions for decades. So I think now they feel Trump's only options are to escalate quite dramatically. But again, the Iranians have other cards to play, as we discussed earlier, with the Houthis, perhaps with renewed attacks on the Gulf. But they feel now that they are negotiating from a position of strength. And I think this is very frustrating for President Trump, who just does not understand why they won't capitulate. And for him, he's really, I think, thinking in historical terms. He wants to be remembered as a president who dealt with the Iranian threat once and for all, who came to an agreement that was better than the JCPOA, the agreement that Obama forged exactly in 2015. So now we have both sides who believe that the longer this goes on, the more their leverage will increase. And unfortunately, I think the rest of the world will suffer because of the mounting costs on the global economy.
Could you just amplify on that in terms of what exactly, I mean, obviously, what would be the impact in terms of energy?
Yeah. So I think the energy consequences have been delayed in many ways because when the conflict started, a lot of oil was already being shipped around the world. So a lot of oil tankers had already got through the Strait of Hormuz and were heading towards their destinations around the world. So it actually took some time for the for the effects of the reduction in oil supply to play out in some parts of the world. But then we have seen some mitigation strategies that have worked. So Saudi Arabia really ramped up its production, or sort of its transportation of oil out of its western coast through the Yanbu port. And so I think in the short term that has helped stabilize prices to a degree, even though of course they have gone up. You don't need me to tell you that. I've read about the terrible impacts on India.
Yeah.
And elsewhere. But I think this will increase over time. And I think also we'll see other ripple effects of it. So the food security is often tied very closely with energy prices because in part of the costs of transporting food. But the disruption of fertilizers from out of the Strait of Hormuz is something, again, where the costs of that were not likely to be felt in the very short term because probably a lot of farmers had already bought their fertilizers. I suppose we're coming towards the planting season in the southern hemisphere, but for the northern hemisphere, probably for this year, farmers would be okay, but it's next year when the disruptions will start to be felt and the spike in prices will start to be felt. So some of these costs have already been baked in, I think, and they are only going to grow as this conflict drags on. And even if it doesn't drag on, even if it ends, we will feel the knock-on effects, unfortunately, for months to come. But I continued to be very surprised that the stock markets in the US and some other parts of the world don't seem to factor in some of these costs. I am not an economist. I'm not an investment banker, but I don't really understand why the stock market here seems to just continue to rise, given what we know is coming. I hope they know things I don't know, because I hope that some of these
I hope so too.
Yeah.
If whichever way this conflict supposing if there is a ceasefire and they come to some kind of agreement, how do you think, how do you think the situation or the power sort of framework in the Middle East would be with Iran sort of having emerged, I'll not say completely victorious, but certainly having bested the United States and all these other tensions you've just mentioned?
Yeah. I think in some ways the Pandora's box has been opened and it's very difficult to close it once some of these tactics have been tried. We now know that Iran can threaten the Strait of Hormuz very easily. It will probably agree not to do that again in some kind of ceasefire deal. But we know that if conditions change in the future, that's probably the first thing they're going to choose to do again. So second, I'd say we know that they can use their, quite cheap weapons to threaten, some of these global or regional, at least, economic centers. Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, Riyadh, using drones, using missiles. And again, it's going to be difficult, I think, to imagine, well, we now know what that looks like. And so it's for those countries, they're really going to want to expand their security relationships. I think they're going to want to develop their domestic security capabilities. I think they're probably going to double down on the US, and they will not want to move away from the US, but equally they will look to add additional security partners. I mentioned that Saudi Arabia is looking to Turkey and Pakistan. I think they want to add to their current security relationships rather than subtracting or replacing. There's going to be a lot of work to do to build trust between the Iranian regime and some of these regional actors. And, probably that trust will never be fully built or rebuilt. But in some ways, they're going to have to try, because they do share this neighborhood. They will need to come to an agreement to try to prevent this from happening again. But I would expect that as many of these states as possible will try to diversify away from reliance on the Strait of Hormuz. So I think in some ways this will accelerate their economic diversification strategies. They'll look to probably invest in alternative routes. This is where, actually, interestingly, some countries like Syria may really benefit from this, because land routes become more appealing. And Syria has been trying to pitch itself as a regional hub that could connect Europe with the Gulf, even going into sort of Central Asia and Africa. They really want to be that central node. I don't think that's going to be fully realized, but I think to some degree it will. I think we will see more probably investment in Mediterranean ports in Syria and infrastructure. So they could benefit to some degree. But then I think one of the other big questions is what happens to the Gulf's sovereign wealth funds, and what happens to their current strategies of investing their capital strategically, not just in the region, but beyond it. Are they going to be forced to pull that back? And will they stop investing in places like sub-Saharan Africa, in other parts of the world, because they need to focus on economic recovery? And I think that's kind of an open question at the moment, because we don't know exactly the costs and the scale of the rebuilding that's going to be necessary. But this could quite fundamentally change their role in the world, because they have to start looking internally and focusing their resources internally in a way that they haven't previously had to the same degree.
If we have this, this kind of half peace or an unsettled peace, which is brought about by this ceasefire, where does that leave Israel actually? And, what does Israel do next?
I think this is where it's difficult to say, because we don't know the terms under which this conflict ends. The Iranians do not want a ceasefire that will open them up to an attack by Israel again in 6 months down the line, a year down the line. They are talking about a permanent peace that they would like to be ratified. They'd like to have a treaty that's ratified by the US Congress. They would like to have a UN Security Council resolution. And so they're trying to add institutional weight to the agreement that they come to, because they fear that Israel will just attack again really whenever they want. And I don't think the Iranians are likely to get that, but that's what they're pushing for, because their big fear is that this conflict ends in some kind of agreement that, is just undone a little down the line. So I think for Israel, they're probably going to be very, very concerned about what happens to Iran's nuclear program. I think this is why the Israelis are very focused on what happens to that highly enriched uranium. They are very focused on the dismantling of Iran's nuclear facilities. They want a very long moratorium of enriching uranium in Iran, because I think their fundamental fear, perhaps, is that the lesson the Iranian regime takes from this conflict is if only they had had nuclear weapons capabilities, none of this would have happened. And so, although we've seen the destruction to many of the nuclear facilities, and although it would be a lot harder now for Iran to reach or to achieve those capabilities, probably their determination to achieve them is higher than it has ever been. And I think that is going to be Israel's primary concern going forward. And I think there are no easy answers to that. And I think that's why Israel is pushing, or it seems to be pushing, for a renewal of the military part of this. But then there are big questions of what can a renewed military campaign do now that it previously failed to achieve.
Much of this originates in the question of Palestine and Gaza. So there's not been much talk of this in this whole conflict. But surely, this treaty and other things cannot be signed with some kind of view, assurance, thought on the Palestinian question.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And even I think in my answer to your very first question about how the strategic landscape was changing, it all started with those October the 7th attacks by Hamas. I think in some ways, the conflict has forced different actors to focus more on their own security interests and probably to deprioritize the Palestinian question in all of this. Hezbollah, to a degree, is now focused on its survival in Lebanon rather than trying to push for rights for recognition for Palestine. That's probably true of many of the Arab Gulf states as well. And I think there is generally a feeling that Israel has successfully shifted the reality on the ground in the occupied Palestinian territories that have made it essentially impossible at this stage to have a two-state solution. Through the expansion of settlements, through the restrictions that they have placed on Palestinians, and of course through their conflict in Gaza as well. So I think we are not hearing very many people talking about it because I think it seems so far away that there would be a solution to the Palestinian question, or some kind of real effort to push for Palestinian statehood. I think just other issues have taken over. But there is something to be said for the fact that this continues to be at the core, at the heart of so many of these problems, at least rhetorically. A lot of these actors are saying that they are opposed to Israel because of Israel's, oppression of Palestinians and determination to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state. And so, I've heard some people say if that peace were resolved, that would allow then for all of these other understandings to be made with the Houthis, with Hezbollah, with Iran even. I just think we're a long way away from that. And it doesn't seem like anyone is really prioritizing that in this moment.
My sort of final question is, where does this leave the United States in terms of, its position in the international system?
Yeah.
Of success?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and one that I think, on one level, I think there has to be another reputational hit to the United States. I think many actors around the world interpret this to have been a war of choice by the United States, and a war that came with enormous costs, and then that the United States failed to appreciate those costs and failed to act in ways that support their partners and allies around the world as they dealt with those costs. And so I think we have to assume there will be a backlash to the United States, because, it will almost be seen as a selfish conflict and a huge risk that, just failed to achieve, really any of the strategic goals. I think we were already seeing the shifting of the global order and the shifting balance of power, different states forging new kinds of relationships. In the first year of the second Trump administration, a lot of these states were beginning to articulate what a plan B might look like that is less reliant on the US. And I would expect the search for plan Bs and the pursuit of plan Bs to accelerate after this. And I think we'll see new kinds of relationships. The EU and ASEAN, Canada and some East Asian countries. I think there are various ways that this will play out. But my sort of other big fear is that the Middle East proves to be a preview of the global disorder that might be coming. Again, in part, I think this is this idea of a Pandora's box having been opened, where we've already seen, I think Indonesia talked about charging for maritime fees on shipping coming through the Strait of Malacca. Will others learn that they can also threaten strategic choke points and achieve, real influence on global affairs? Will others learn from some of Iran's quite cheap attacks and seek to mimic those? And fundamentally, are we moving into a system where now it is the will of the mighty, and we will see more powerful states taking, sort of military adventures to try to deal with threats, casting aside international norms, international law, and whatnot. And it could be that this proves to be a preview of what we will see elsewhere. I'm sorry to end on that note because it's such a depressing one.
I know. No, that's a very sharp insight and rather grim portent for the future. But thank you so much. Your insights were absolutely valuable. And we look forward at some stage, a couple of months down the line, to speaking with you again on how the situation develops.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you. And I hope that if I do come back, we'll have some more optimistic things to talk about.
I hope so too. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.